Good morning, everyone. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. Today is Friday. It's November the 6th. We're getting ready for Parshas Vayera. I'd like to share a brief Devar Torah with you. We're all accustomed to looking at Parshas Vayera, specifically the beginning of it, and learning so much from Avram Avinu. We learn what type of an incredible Baal Chesed he was. The Parsha begins that he's in a conversation with Hashem. Hashem has come to visit him as he's recovering from a bris milah. And then when he sees these three travelers who are passing by, he sees these three travelers, and he stops his conversation with Hashem because he's such a passionate Baal Chesed. He wants to be engaged in kindness. He stops that conversation and he runs to greet them, and he does whatever he can to make them feel at home and to feed them. And we learned so much about this, about Avram Avinu, how he felt towards them, and how important it was to be involved in such acts of kindness. And we see that he was under no misconceptions as to who these people may have been. He didn't think maybe these are some great tzaddikim. He was fully aware that these people may be idol worshippers. We know that because one of the first things he asked them to do when he entered the home was to wash their feet. And Rashi quotes the famous teaching that says the reason he wanted them to wash their feet was because he figured that they were idol worshippers and there were some vestiges of idol worship that were still on their feet. And these were the people that he wanted to do chesed for. And he was so engaged in this type of kindness. We can learn so much from Avram Avinu, that we want to be engaged in acts of kindness, and we're not limiting them just to people who look like us and just to people who share our own values, but what we can do to help be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim and spread the word and spread the message about Kadosh Baruch Hu to the world around us by sharing chesed with all who we may interact with. But I think if we can find another level of an incredible greatness of Avram Avinu and what we could learn from him through this incident. A few years ago, Rabbi Yisrael Reisman in his Chumash here, he raised an he brought up an incredible observation, and I want to share that with you. We know that this incident occurred on Pesach. How do we know this? Because in the message that these angels, that these visitors share with him, they say when they are saying that they're going to have a child, they say, "Vayomer shova shuva elecha keis chaya." We're going to return to you again, exactly this point next year. And your wife will have a son. Rashi there quotes the Chazal. That what does that mean? He says at this point, Pesach chaya. It was Pesach when these visitors arrived at Avram and Sarah's tent. Well, Pesach haba nolad Yitzchak. And Yitzchak was born the following year on Pesach. So this incident occurs on Pesach. That being the case, Rabbi Reisman said someone asked him the following question. When these visitors arrive, and Avram's under no misconception, he suspects that they're idol worshippers. He goes into his tent and he tells Sarah, "Mahir Avram ha'ola el Sarah v'yomer mahari shalosim kemach solas lushi v'asi ugos." It's time, we need to start baking for them. And then Avram himself goes together with Yishmael, and they start putting together a feast with the Ben Bakar, with the calf that they slaughtered, and they prepare for these guests. So they're cooking for them, they're baking for them, and it's Pesach. Now, if we understand that Chazal tell us that Avram and Sarah, and all the Avos, before Matan Torah, even before the Torah was given, they, through their intuition, Ruach HaKodesh, their divine inspiration, however you want to say it, they knew what all the mitzvahs were going to be, and they strove to the best of their ability to observe all the mitzvahs. How do we understand how they are baking and cooking and preparing for Akum, for Ovdei Kochavim U'Mazolos, for idol worshippers on Pesach? We have a general rule that we're allowed to cook and bake on Yom Tov. For who? For members of Klal Yisrael. So again, this is before Matan Torah, before the Torah was given, but if we're working with that stream of thought that the Avos tried their best, strived to observe as much of the Torah as possible and all the mitzvahs, even the Rabbanans as possible. So then how do we understand that? This was a question Rabbi Reisman said he was asked a few years ago. And here was the answer that he suggested. He said that Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky Zatzal had a famous yesod that he would share when he spoke about the Parsha. And he says as follows. There are many times that Chazal ask questions about activities, behaviors of the various avos that they don't seem to be in sync with the mitzvahs in the Torah. And okay, we can take the easy way out and say it was before the Torah was given. But again, there's a whole stream within Chazal that says that the avos, they did their best to observe all the mitzvahs in the Torah. How can you reconcile this? So Rav Yaakov had a famous yesod. He says his idea was as follows. He would say that the avos, what mitzvahs in the Torah did they observe? Only if it was lechumra. Only if it was, let's say, something that would, would impose some type of a hardship, so to say, on their lives. But they would never use those mitzvahs to impose a chumrah on someone else, to impose a hardship on somebody other than themselves. So what's an example? Rabbi Yaakov said Rabbi Reisman said that Rabbi Yaakov used this approach to answer the question that shows up many times. One example was as follows. All the Mefarshim ask, all the commentaries ask, how did Yaakov marry two sisters? How did he marry two sisters? The Torah says not to, and we know that the Avos, according to the stream, the Avos tried their best to observe all the mitzvahs in the Torah. So how did Yaakov Avinu marry two sisters? So Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky used to answer as follows. He says, yes, there are many answers to this question, but he says, I'd like to answer a simple suggested answer. Yaakov Avinu had made a pact with Rachel that he was going to marry her. Yes, something came up. Lavan, his father-in-law, tricked him, and he had to marry Leah first. That's true. But he had already made this deal. He had already made a deal with Rachel that he was going to be marrying her. How could he not marry her now? Because the Torah, which hasn't yet been given, says a person's not supposed to marry two sisters. But then I would impose that chumrah on Rachel. That would devastate her. He had already, in a sense, proposed to her. He had said that he was going to marry her and then work 7 years for her father for her. He had already made that arrangement. And now he's going to say, well, because of the fact that even though the Torah isn't given, I'm choosing to keep it. I can't marry you. That's not fair to her. I can't impose that chumrah on her. So therefore, Rabbi Yaakov wanted to suggest that's how Yaakov Avinu was able to marry two sisters. Because again, at a time before the Torah was given, the Avos only observed the mitzvahs if it only presented a hardship on themselves, but not to impose a chumrah on somebody else. So Rabbi Reisman wanted to take that approach and say that we can answer that question here as well. How did Abraham and Sarah, how did they prepare? How did they cook? How did they bake? I was Pesach. How did they prepare these foods for an akum, for Avdei Kochavim Umazalos? People they clearly suspected of that. How did they do that? Again, it's before the Torah was given, but if we're assuming they tried to observe all the mitzvahs even at that stage, how did they do that? Because they said, what would my observance of those mitzvahs do now? That wouldn't be a chumrah on me. That wouldn't be a hardship on me. I'd be imposing that hardship on these travelers. And Nebuch, they're hungry. They need a meal. How can I impose this mitzvah that hasn't yet been given on them, which is going to deprive them of fresh food, a meal that they so require? Therefore, Avram and Sarah, as passionate as they were to trying to observe all the Torah and the mitzvahs before they were given, in this situation, they understood that they couldn't. I think this gives us, if this is true, this gives us a whole new appreciation for Avraham Avinu and what we could emulate of him. Not only was he the paradigm of Gemilas Chasadim, look how much he did, and we always knew that looking at this Parsha, how he went out of his way to share such kindness with strangers, people who didn't share his values, but more than that, look how he was so sensitive to their feelings, according to this approach of Rav Yaakov. According to this approach, he was so sensitive to their feelings that not only was he willing to do chesed and share with them, but he was willing to not observe some of the Torah and mitzvahs, which he had already been observing, even though the Torah hadn't been given yet, but he'd been observing in a situation where it was only imposing a hardship on him. But if it's going to impose a hardship on others, even Ovdei Kochavim Umazalos, even pagans, idol worships, he says, no, I can't impose the Torah on them now. They deserve a fresh meal. And he was ready to give that to them. In my mind, this is just incredibly eye-opening because it's a whole new dimension, shows us a whole new dimension of Avraham and Sarah, what their chesed meant. Not only did they want to share with others, but that Torah and the mitzvahs that they were so passionate observing before it was given, they were ready to put that on hold if they saw that it was going to impose a hardship on somebody else. And who was that somebody else? Even people who could be Ovdei Chachavim and Mazolos, even potential idolaters. That's how sensitive they were to their needs. So if this is all true, this is a lesson for us, how sensitive we need to be to the feelings of those around us. If it's true to idol worshipers, kol sheken, certainly to our family members, to our spouses, our children, our parents, the members of our community, our shuls, our neighbors, everybody around us, how sensitive we have to be to their feelings and not do anything that could potentially be hurtful to them. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.